This is Written in Bone, Chapter 3, Out of the Grave. J.R. 1225b's bones were so fragile that they had to be removed from his grave with the supporting soil of the pedestal still beneath them. Remember, when you pedestal the soil, you remove the soil from the top and the side of the remains, but you leave the soil underneath. Otherwise, they would have crumbled to bits. With the soil still in place, the bones were carefully transferred onto trays and sent for conservation, a treatment process to protect them from decay and damage. Remember that word, conservation, a treatment to protect the bones from decay and damage. Although archaeologists may begin this process while the bones are in situ, Kelso's team felt that conserving J.R. 1225b's bones in the lab would be easier. This process took place at the Jamestown Rediscovery Project's conservation laboratory near the excavation site. First, senior conservator Michael Lavin set aside several untreated bone samples to send to Owsley for scientific analysis that require bone material that has not been conserved. Using soft brushes, dental picks, and specially treated water, Lavin removed all traces of the soil that clung to J.R. 1225b's bones. Here is a close-up of J.R. 1225b. So this is his skull. It shows how fragile the bones were. You can see that the jaw has broken apart from the rest of the skull. Remember in the last chapter, they pedestal the bones and try to study the skeleton in situ, exactly where they found it, how they found it, because the bones are very fragile and they can disintegrate if you move them. The next step, drying the skeleton, took a remarkable 2 weeks. Although the skeletal material may appear dry within hours, it still retains some moisture, Lavin stated. This hidden moisture must be removed gradually to prevent the bones from shrinking. Much as they had in the grave after heavy rains. Lavin further explained that conservation experts solved this problem by placing the bones in drying racks and covering them with plastic perforated with small holes. The holes control the amount of air that reaches the bones, slowing the drying process. Next, Lavin coated the bones with an acrylic mixture that acts like glue, binding the bone tightly to prevent breakage or flaking. After the mixture dried, he fitted together fragments of broken bones and glued them as well. Finally, he wrapped J.R. 1225b's labeled conserved bones with a clear plastic material specially made for protecting fragile items and placed them in storage boxes. To prevent damage from changes in the atmosphere, the boxes were kept in a temperature-controlled and humidity-controlled vault until they were sent to Owsley's forensic laboratory at the Smithsonian Institution. So here are some careful conservation techniques. These are used to protect the skeletal remains from further damage. Remember, they're very fragile. They can break and flake very easily. So this is Lavin. He is applying an acrylic mixture to the bones in situ. So he's got this acrylic mixture here, and you can see, I guess it's a paintbrush, and Q-tips too. And in situ, this is exactly where they found J.R. 1225. The process, they've done the pedestaling, so they've removed the dirt from around it and above it, but left the dirt underneath it. There, Owsley and his colleague, Carrie Bruhlheide, a skeletal biologist and forensic anthropologist, laid the skeleton on a table, each bone in its anatomically correct position. Using a magnifying lens, they examined each bone and tooth and made notes of their observations. Next, Owsley and Bruhlheide used precise measuring tools called calipers to measure J.R. 1225b's long bones. These measurements are compared with those that were made in situ to confirm their accuracy. So once they've laid it out, in order to make sure that the skeleton is correct, they measure it and then compare it to the measurements from when it was still in the grave. By plugging these measurements into a mathematical formula, they determined the teenager's height was about 5 feet 8 inches, unusually tall for the 17th century, and he was still growing. After the measurements were taken, the forensic anthropologists set aside additional bone and tooth samples for laboratory tests. The scientists turned their attention to the femur next to which the arrowhead had been found. Close examination confirmed Owsley's initial opinion at the gravesite. The arrowhead had not penetrated or damaged the femur in any visible way. That still left the possibility the wound had become infected and had led to blood poisoning, which would have killed the boy without causing any damage to the bone. Forensic examination of a different bone, the boy's right clavicle, or collarbone, provided another clue. The clavicle had been fractured. Its broken edges hadn't healed at all, indicating that the break must have occurred shortly before the boy died. This injury helps explain why the boy's right arm and shoulder had slid into such an awkward, abnormal position as he was placed into his grave. The shoulder could slide into that position only because the clavicle was broken. Together, the arrow wound and the broken clavicle led Owsley and Ruhlheide to conclude that the boy had likely died as a result of violence. So here it is. When J.R. 1225B's body was placed in his grave, his broken clavicle, remember that's the collarbone, caused his arm to shift, to slide into a position that would have been otherwise impossible. I don't know what happened with this page. Sorry. The boy had other health issues too. A depression in the front of his skull above his left eye socket revealed that he'd sustained a blow to the head that had healed before his death. The bone in the roofs of his eye socket contained small holes, a sign that his diet lacked sufficient iron. And x-rays of the boy's leg bones showed bands called Harris lines, which form when the growth of a bone repeatedly stops and restarts. Such disruptions of growth are a result of poor nutrition or the stress of disease. The most serious problem by far, however, was a raging, ongoing infection in the boy's lower jaw, where two central incisors were damaged. The left incisor was broken in half, exposing the pulp, the soft inner part of a tooth that contains the nerves and blood vessels. Ooh, that sounds painful. At first, the injury would have caused intense pain, particularly at mealtimes, because the exposed pulp chamber would have been extremely sensitive to cold and heat. The boy probably covered the broken tooth with his lower lip and tongue to protect the exposed nerve from hot and cold foods. Oh, that just sounds awful. Within 10 days, as the pulp deteriorated, a pus-filled area called an abscess formed at the tooth's root. After a week or two, the nerve of the tooth died, ending the pain the boy felt from hot and cold substances. So here you can see the infection in J.R. 1225B's chin made the bone so brittle that parts of it crumbled away after burial. So he'd had such a bad infection right here that after his burial it just crumbled away. Two of the teeth in the lower part of the jaw had been broken. The exposed pulp inside of one of them opened the door to infection. So here we are. Woo! Makes my mouth hurt. The problem hadn't gone away, though. Owsley saw signs that the abscess spread, further inflaming the bone socket and the surrounding gum tissue. During a period of several months, bacteria and infection spread into the bone of the boy's chin and jaw. Once the infection had spread that far, J.R. 1225B would have been in severe pain again, possibly worse than before. Left unchecked, the infection would have affected his immune system. Colonial people often died from infections that modern antibiotic medicines can cure. Depending on the type of bacteria involved, the severity of J.R. 1225B's infection would have soon caused him to die. It's likely that the boy's sudden death as a result of the arrowhead wound only shortened his life by a few months, if not weeks. If a Jamestown teenager were alive today, his broken tooth could have been treated. An endodontist, a dentist who specializes in diseases of the tooth pulp, would drill the nerve out of the broken tooth's root and pack the empty root canal with a filling material. Modern painkillers make this procedure far less excruciating than the suffering J.R. 1225B endured. Finally, a dentist would replace the top part of the broken tooth with a false crown made of a tooth-colored, porcelain-like material, Within days, the boy would have been enjoying his meals without any problem. He ate like an Englishman. One kind of laboratory test critical to forensic anthropology is called stable isotope analysis. Stable isotope analysis can supply information about a person's diet, and in the case of some colonial settlers, provide clues to the settler's birthplace and how long he or she had lived in America. The stories gleaned from laboratory examinations and tests are detailed, fascinating, and sometimes shocking. The next facts that JR 1225b's bones revealed came via a chemical element called carbon. When green plants undergo the nutrient-making process of photosynthesis, they absorb varying amounts of three forms, or isotopes, of this element: carbon-12, carbon-13, and carbon-14. Carbon-12 has 6 protons and 6 neutrons in the nucleus of each atom. Carbon-13 has 6 protons and 7 neutrons, and carbon-14 contains 6 protons and 8 neutrons. Carbon-12 and carbon-13 are called stable isotopes because they don't break down over time as carbon-14 does. All 3 isotopes are absorbed by bones when people consume green plants. Carbon-13 is of particular interest to forensic anthropologists for 2 reasons. First, the amount of carbon-13 that bones absorb varies depending on the type of plants a person eats. Second, as a stable isotope, carbon-13 remains in a person's bones after death and can be measured even centuries later. The 2 characteristics enable scientists to determine what plants the person ate, and sometimes, based on where those plants commonly grow, where the person lived. In colonial Chesapeake studies, the key plant is corn, which grows in many parts of North America and contains more carbon-13 than any other grain. Corn played a significant part in the diets of Native Americans and colonists. Before their arrival in North America, however, the colonists would have eaten grains that were commonly grown in Europe: barley, wheat, rye, for example, which contain a much lower amount of carbon-13. As a person's diet changes, the nutrients that the body transports to the bones reflect the new foods. Over time, the bones themselves change. For example, when people born in England moved to the American colonies and started to eat more corn, the level of carbon-13 in their bones slowly increased. Scientists think that it takes about 20 years for a bone's carbon-13 content to be completely replaced by dietary change. The amount of carbon-13 found in bones can be measured and analyzed based on scientific research to determine a number known as the carbon-13 value. This value is written as a negative number, that is, a number less than 0. A person born and raised in England, for example, typically has a carbon-13 level with a value between -21 and -18. The carbon-13 value for a person born and raised in North America on a diet that included corn would be in the range of -15 to -9. Scientists believe that a value between -18 and -16 in a colonial American's remains indicate the colonist was probably born and raised in England and immigrated to North America, where he or she lived less than 20 years before death. The isotope analysis of the samples taken from JR 1225b's bones revealed a carbon-13 value of -19.3. The value of -19.3 is very English, with absolutely no corn influencing his diet, Bruelheide noted. Because the amount of carbon-13 in the boy's bones is so low, Owsley and Bruelheide are confident that he had only arrived from England when he died. The isotope analysis fits perfectly with JR 1225b's identity as a boy likely in service to one or more of the men, or a ship's boy who was killed shortly after arriving in Virginia. Bruelheide added, "In fact, he may have been a victim of a documented Indian attack on Jamesport that took place on May 25, 1607. One colonial document which describes this attack mentions that a boy was killed. The historical evidence uncovered so far supports this theory. Catherine Coral Walls volunteers as a historian for the Association for the Preservation of Virginia Antiquities. One of her goals is to identify JR 1225B by researching the historical record. At least 4 boys were known